So last time going through this, we were busy dealing with Moses, and Moses, after murdering a man and running away, and then ending up in the desert and spending 40 years out in the desert, he's walking one day and he sees that bush, and in the middle of that bush, he sees that there's what he calls a fire. Now remember something. He's describing it to the best of his ability. Okay, it would be the same as if you looked up and you saw a large bird, like a really, really big bird. You'd say, man, there was a big bird like an eagle. Okay, you don't know if it's an eagle, but that's the word that you have to describe it. So same with Moses. He sees the burning bush, or what we've come to know as the burning bush, and in the midst of this bush, he sees what he thinks as fire. And that's how he describes it. It's fire. And then we see later on that it's the presence of God in that bush. Not that God's confined to the bush, but that's how God is making himself known to Moses. And then when Moses approaches, he says to him, hey, take your sandals off. This is holy ground. It's funny because when King Solomon dedicates the temple, it says there that the glory of God, and that glory is kabod, the weightiness of God, that comes in, and that glory of God hovers over the altar. And in that holy of holies room that is pitch black because there's a curtain on it, there's obviously light inside there, because the priests don't take a flashlight in with them or anything like that. There's a light inside there. Same thing happened in the tabernacle in the wilderness. There was his glory, his kabod, and he said, okay, so it's in this spot that I'm going to meet with you. That's what he talks to Moses about. And here in this bush, there's this glow, this glory of God, and it's in this bush. So Moses is using words to the best of his ability to kind of describe what's going on, okay? So then, as we work through this, as Moses has this conversation with God, and God's telling him, I'm going to use you to go and get a hold of the people that are stuck down in Egypt in slavery, and you're going to lead them out, and they're going backwards and forwards, and Moses is saying, no, not me, and God's saying, yes, you. He's saying they won't listen, God's saying, yeah, they'll listen, and they go backwards and forwards, okay. Then Moses says to God, okay, so they're not going to listen. God says, okay, here's what we're going to do, and I'll give you a bunch of signs. And he gives them a bunch of signs. And as we went over this on Sunday, I think it was, that first sign was his staff, which was his authority, his calling, what his ministry was going to be, and that was that of a shepherd. And God says, throw it down. He throws it down, and he realizes something, that it becomes a serpent. And that is a huge step. The first step for anybody stepping into ministry is to realize that that thing will bite you. It can be a serpent. Then he says to him, okay, stick your hand inside your tunic. And interesting, he puts it over his heart. Pulls it out the first time, and it's all leprous, full of sin. Puts it in a second time, and it's clean. It's almost like God saying to him, okay, so now here's your ministry. Don't worship your ministry, worship me. Then he says, okay, and here's your heart. You've got to deal with your own heart first. This is what your heart is. It's leprous. Deal with that, and then you can step into ministry. And then he says, okay, fine, and now you can go out and preach the cross, basically. And why preach the cross? Because it's talking about the blood and the water, which is what was symbolic on the cross when they stabbed Jesus, right? And it's talking about the miracle in the Nile, that it's going to turn to blood. But then Moses says something very interesting in chapter 4, verse 10. And this is what you picked up on, James. It says, then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Now, there's a lot of different teachings out there on this verse, and a lot of them turn around and say, okay, so Moses had a stutter, or his tongue, he had a cleft palate, all these different things. So I went and really did word searches on this and really dug in deep as far as these words go. I said to you that glow that was in the bush, the word for that is kabod, which means it's the weightiness of God, the heaviness of God. If somebody tells you something interesting or factual, and you turn, wow, that's heavy, man. That's the same idea. That's this heaviness, okay? The word here where he says, I am slow of speech and slow of tongue, that slow it breaks down to it's the same origin. It's the same word origin. It's this heaviness, okay, the weightiness. And it's almost like what Moses is saying to him is, hey, I don't have a grasp on these heavy things, these intricacies of language, okay? And turn with me first to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 2. So now in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, okay? And he's writing to them about a visit that he had with them. And he's writing a letter. Basically, it's a letter of correction that he's writing to them. But this is what I wanted to pick up on. He says here in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech." Okay? That's that phrase there. I did not come with excellence of speech. That excellence of speech there, if you break that down, because now this is the Greek, means superior speech, and it's getting into the superior and dealing with the deities and that of God. Okay? So Paul here is saying, when I came to you guys and I spoke to you at Corinth, I didn't come with this well-educated argument about who God is. That's what he's saying. Why is he saying this? If you jump back to, it's in the go back a couple of pages, book of Acts, chapter 17, I think it is. Paul at Ephesus. Yes. Book of Acts, chapter 17. Paul now is going to, from verse 16 on, he goes to Athens. And when we went through the book of Acts, we spoke about this. Paul gets to Athens, and there's a place there called the Areopagus. And at this place is where all the educated guys sat down. Now, what was going on in this time period is that they worshipped cleverness, if you want to call it that. And all these so-called intellectual guys would get together and they would discuss philosophies. And the city had literally hundreds of different gods. And they didn't want to offend a god, so what they did is they had like with the Romans will do a flat section, and then they'll have a bust on it, okay? They did the same sort of thing. In their walls, they'd have these carved out little niches, and inside that would be a little statue of a god, one of their deities, and they would be all over the city. Well, they had one of these things, these little niches, and it had no god in it. And underneath it said there, "To the unknown God." And the reason why they were doing that is because these guys were so clever, so they thought, they were so smart, that they would worship this unknown God just in case we forgot about a God and we don't want to offend the God. Therefore, we'll still worship the God that we don't know. Okay? That's what they were doing. So Paul walks into the city, and he walks around for a couple of days, and he sees this. So he's like, okay, these guys are really clever, and he starts listening to what they're saying and the way of their thinking and everything. Well, what these guys were thinking at that time was that behind every idea, okay, there's a thought, and behind that there's a thinker, and that's how deep in the verbal BS they were getting into, okay, and they would spend days just sitting up in this place, this Areopagus, discussing these deep things, and people would gather around and listen, and this was almost like their form of entertainment, okay? And you had these major people, oh, so-and-so's coming to town, let's go and listen to his version of this, and they'd get together and debate these things, okay? So Paul arrives there, and he says to them, oh, I see you've got this unknown God. I'm going to tell you about the unknown God, and the unknown God is the Logos. Now, as I mentioned, their way of thinking, and one of the philosophies that they were putting forward was, okay, so There's a word, an idea. Behind the idea is a thought, a word, the logos, and behind that is the thinker. And so Paul's taking it one step further, and he's saying, okay, but before all of that, there is the word, okay, and that's where God is. God spoke the word, and that's how he's going to tackle this thing. So he gives us a lot of thought, okay, and then he comes out and he starts addressing them, and he says here in verse 22 of chapter 17, he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious." Notice that word religious, not God-fearing. He said, verse 23, "For I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship. I've even found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God." Now he goes on, "Therefore," and now he launches his argument, okay, about all these things that these guys want to get behind, and these ideas, and these temples that are made with man's hands and everything else. And if you go through this argument as he tells them about God, he touches on Jesus Christ. And he says here in verse 31, "Because he," that is God, "has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man," okay, the man, that's a reference to Jesus Christ, "whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead." That's all Paul talks about as far as Jesus goes. That's all he says, okay? Well, when you get to the end of chapter 17 here, and you go to verse 18, it says in the next sentence, "After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth." Okay, we just touched on Corinth. What happened here? Nothing. There's no church that was established here. So Paul comes up with this great philosophical argument, okay? And it's a really good argument if you read it. But he doesn't preach the cross. That's what's missing from his argument. He doesn't preach, like I said, the blood and the water, the cross. He doesn't preach that. And nothing happens. However, in verse 34, "However, some men joined him and believed," and then amongst them it names a couple of guys. That's all that happens there. This is the one place that no church is established, because he doesn't preach the cross. The next place he goes to is Corinth, which is where we started off in Corinthians, and he says to them, "Hey, I'm not coming to you with a clever argument." And he goes on and he says, "I'm not coming to you with excellence of speech or wisdom, declaring you the testimony of God." I'm not going to come and tell you about God in a clever way. He says, "For I determined not to know anything amongst you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Now all of a sudden Paul changes his tune big time. That's what he realizes he has to preach. So here, when jump back into Exodus, in Exodus, when Moses turns around and he says to God, "I am slow of speech and slow of tongue," and it's that slow is talking about the kabod, the heaviness, these weighty matters of God. Is he saying my tongue is heavy and my mouth's heavy? Or is he turning around and saying, "You know what, Lord, I don't quite know what to say"?
My Bible says, "I'm slow of speech and have a heavy and awkward tongue."
Okay. So when I've said to you before, the Bible always interprets the Bible. And you have a look at this thing of what Paul's saying here, and he's using the same phraseology there with regards to speech and the intricacies of the word. Interesting, I had an opportunity the other day. Excuse me, a young man came back to me on something that I posted on the internet. And Shell told me about it. And I was going to get back to him. And my natural tendency, if somebody wants to argue with me on the internet, especially over something like that, it's like, turn or burn, and I'm done. I don't want to type out a whole long thing, and that would be my natural tendency. And there was, who was it? Oh, it was Miss Carol. Miss Carol had seen this guy's response, and she'd said to me, I wanted to respond, but I just didn't feel like I had all the ammunition to go back at him and give him a full response. Well, I sat down one morning, and it was just before I was supposed to go to work, and actually it was one of the days I was coming out to you, and I was running late. And that's why I was running late. I sat down and I started to type to him, and before I knew it, like literally about an hour had gone past. And I typed, and when I got done and I read it myself, I was like, wow, that's pretty good. But it was just so contrary to what my nature is. My nature is like, turn and burn, And yet here was something that was heartfelt, and it was in a very loving way. And that's something that I've struggled with, and that is to, like the Bible says, temper your speech with love. Do all things in love, and everything is love. And I'm like, what is this fuzzy thing called love? It's something I battle with. And here all of a sudden, this came out. My point is that if God is sending you somewhere, He's going to equip you. Even if it's not in your nature. Even if you're like Moses here, who's got the slow speech and the slow tongue kind of thing. Don't worry about it. If God is calling you, just do it. Just go for it. Then, here's where I wanted to get to tonight. Since we're going to be a small group, and I want to throw this out at you. What I have been taught in churches, is that in the beginning, there were only a few people, and those people intermarried and married their brother and their sister and their cousin, and they had kids, and everything was fine because the gene pool was relatively clean at that point, right? And as time went on, that gene pool became corrupted, and eventually God passes a law. Okay, it's not fine anymore to marry your sister and everything else, and then we pass laws. Hey, it's not good because medical science has now shown us that if you do that, you could have a child that's blind or deaf or whatever because of these gene deficiencies, right? And the other thing that we've been taught in church is that, according to the Bible, it says that God is love. That's His character, right? So anything contrary to love cannot be from God. So when you see a child that is born deaf, that's either from the gene pool being messed up, or we want to blame Satan, or it's because we live in a fallen world, right? You guys, that's kind of what you guys have heard as well, right? And I do not know how I've never ever seen this. And I went back and read this passage again, even though we'd already taught on it. And something that I don't do, and here it is, verse 11. Look at chapter 4, verse 11. This is God's answer to Moses. And we read this when we were going through this passage, right? So the Lord said to Moses, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? So how does that play into the theology that's been shoved down my throat from churches throughout the years?
It doesn't.
I mean, one of the things we've been dealing with for a little while now is when a problem comes into your life, I've been saying, and it's been big in my life, okay? I've said from the get-go, I cannot sit up here and teach something if I haven't been taught the lesson myself. And I've told Shell we are not doing the book of Job. I'm not teaching the book of Job. That's out. But as I go through and I'm taught a life lesson, right? What I am seeing is that when I'm hit with something, don't focus on the catastrophe. I kind of am now starting to get into a better habit, and it's not happening when it happens. It's normally happening 3 or 4 days later after I've spun around and trying to fix it and all the rest of it. But I'm kind of getting to a point, okay, Lord, what is the lesson in this for me? And that's something that has been coming through on a number of our teachings. So now, to strengthen that, I read this verse, and I see here God saying, okay, so you have a child, and that child is born deaf or blind. Okay? What is your reaction to that? The lesson is not just for that child. I've said to you before, if you've got a pond and in order to picture visually how God works, if you've got a still pond, the water's not moving at all. When God does something, it's almost like he throws a rock into the middle of the pond, and the ripples from that go out in all directions. Anybody who is on the pond or around that pond is going to be affected by that rock hitting that pond in different ways. So too with you and me, when there's a child that has a disability, it's not just that child that's been dealt with. That's not the life lesson. And for me, when we started at the Baptist church, there was a young boy there who was brothers, a pair of brothers. Well, I don't know, it's just two brothers. And the older one had a little bit of a disability, but such that he could still cope. The younger one had Down syndrome pretty severely, very severely. And when we got there, the youth group was kind of crazy. And this kid used to come in and he used to just sit there and kind of hold and rock, I guess, because there was just too much going on. And his older brother would just kind of sit next to him and put his arm around him and just hover around him all the time, not interact with any of the kids or anything like that. And as we came in there, one of the things that has always been placed on my heart is that this Bible says that everything is to be done in decency and in order. And that applies to my life, it applies to the church, it applies to the youth group. So I brought that into the youth group, decency and in order. And we started putting stuff into place, and the kids kicked at the rules and things, but they soon got the hang of it, and all of a sudden that place became a bit more tranquil, and the kids started intermingling more. And then I noticed something. The older brother realized that the younger brother wasn't so spun out anymore. He wasn't rocking so much anymore. And he started leaving his brother and started intermingling, and for the first time he was making friends there. And then as the time went on, I watched the younger brother get off the couch and start intermingling with the other kids for the first time. Okay? That wasn't just for that youngster. It wasn't for him and his brother. It wasn't for him and his brother and all those kids. That had a profound impact on me. Now, can you see what I mean by God throws a rock into a little pond and all of a sudden the ripples go out in all directions? So too with you and me. And here's the thing. That Down syndrome wasn't a curse from Satan on that kid. It also, I don't believe, is, and judge going by scripture, is not a genetic defect. And yes, there are certain things like if a person is dyslexic, that is a hereditary gene that's passed down. I know because my sister is. But why then does one kid get it and the other one doesn't? Do you see what I'm saying? So now all of a sudden I read a verse like this and I'm starting to look at problems, what we view as a problem, more and more and more. Hey, hold on a second, is that really a problem? And now you start to go through the Bible and you start to see other people in the Bible here that God has used in a mighty way. There's one story in particular that I come back to time and time and time again with the kids. It's a guy that was born with a shriveled hand. And God used this guy as one of the judges of Israel to go in and kill a king that had conquered Israel and that was keeping Israel under oppression. And this guy, because he's got a withered right hand, when he walks in to go and bring the tithe to this king, they search him. But because he's got a withered right hand, they search him as they would search anybody on one side. Well, he can't use that hand, so where's he going to put a knife? On the other side. And he walks in and it gives the length of the dagger. The knife that he used is approximately 16 to 19 inches depending on what size the cubit was in that time period. Okay, the cubit, the measurement that's used in the Bible, that was dependent upon the king at the time, and it was taken from there to there. So if it was a big king, the cubit was slightly longer that year. If it was a little king, your cubit was shorter, okay, the measurement. And that it gives the measurement there. So we know somewhere it's roughly about 19 inches long. And it says there that this guy walked in. So this is a big old sword thing that he's got. Yeah, it's not like a little pocket knife that he hid. And he hauls this thing out and stabs the king. Nobody else could walk through past those guards. That was all whole with 2 hands. And we look at the whole people and we think, oh, well, that's the person that's going to get used by God. But you look at people here. Paul, the guy who walked around and healed so many different people miraculously, he had an infirmity. And yet he got other people to sit next to him and pen so many of these letters that make up our Bible today. Okay? So I wanted to throw that out there for everybody just to look, and especially if you're going through something right now and you kind of, oh, woe is me. The flip side of that coin is not woe is me, it's wow is me. Because if God is putting something in your life, a hardship, if he's putting a deaf or a blind or a mute or problem in your life, something huge that you're struggling with, okay? It's not a case of, oh, woe is me, my life is so hard. It's wow is me. God loves me so much that he's putting something in my life to bring about change within my life. Wow, look how much he's looking after me and how much he loves me. Because that's what hardship does, okay? Hardship, I've never, ever seen, it's like comparing Californians and Texans. The Californian people are soft because they have everything so easy. You come across here, and I have been onto people's homes to go and do work, and there are ladies out here that I wouldn't mix it up with because they are tough. On a job that I was at the other day, this lady, and she's, I put her around about the 80 mark, okay? She tripped on the rug and went face down, and I thought something had crashed in the house. I went running out into the home, and here she is on the ground. She smacked her face on the tile floor. I mean, her lips bleeding and everything. I pick her up off the tile floor, and she's got ice, and 5 minutes later, she's chuckling, and she's just fine. Some of the Californian males, oh man, 911, mommy, please help, because they're soft. Hardship, really and truly, it grows you as a person. So don't despise the hardship. Don't despise the blindness or the muteness or whatever God is putting in your path, and get rid of the woe is me mentality, and rather, okay, wow is me. Lord, what are you doing in my life? Okay? I don't know why I went back to this passage, but for somebody here tonight, I believe that's a word from God for you. Okay, off my soapbox. So we left off, we'll now start. We left off last time in, we were going to start verse 18. And it says here, so Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law. Now, when we originally were going through this, I'm glad it's a small group because I've got to admit that I made a mistake and I've got to fix the mistake. So I said to you that Jethro was a priest, was a Midianite priest, okay? But, and I'm just trying to find the verse, what the Bible actually said is, here we go, verse 16 of chapter 2, it says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. Now this is where Moses ends up, okay? Remember he meets that group of shepherdesses, and their father is this guy Jethro. His other name is Ruel. And you remember we dealt with Jacob? Jacob was his earthly name, and then God changed his name to Israel, okay? So you got this tricky dude, and then God changes his name to Israel, governed by God, okay? Here too, you've got this Jethro. The other name, Ruel, which is in verse 18, actually means friend of God. And I've said to you back then, he's a Midianite priest. Yes, he's a priest in Midian. Doesn't make him a Midianite priest, okay? And if you go in Exodus 18:9, jump over there. Sorry, we're jumping around a little bit tonight. In Exodus chapter 18, verse 9, here's the same Jethro. Okay, Moses now has led the people out of Egypt, and they're in the desert, and they're now in this region where Jethro is. And it says here, verse 9, then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he, that's God, had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Verse 11, now I know that the Lord, notice that Lord, all capitalized, that's that tetragrammaton that we spoke about, Yahweh. And he says, the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Notice his declaration there of the one true God. Okay? He's not a Midianite priest. That was my interpretation of my mess. And when you go and look at the language in that, he evidently is a believer. Here's the other thing, Jethro. If you're going to look at that word, this Ruel, it's derived from lover of God. But if you take it further back than that, it actually means remnant. And that remnant is the same remnant that when Elijah was crying out to God, and he was in the cave with depression and everything, he's crying out to God and saying, oh, I'm the only one left, and there are no other Christians around, kind of thing. I know they were Jews, they weren't Christians back then, but it's modern day terms. God says to him, stop whining, go down to the valley, and you'll see I have kept a remnant for myself. There's a bunch of believers. Okay, that same word remnant, that's where his name comes from. That's where it's derived from. So here, this guy is in the land of Midian, which is not quite in Egypt, okay, where the rest of the Jews are. So he's the remnant that is outside. So that's my mess. So now I fixed my mess. So now we can get on tonight's lesson. Okay, so it says in verse 18, so Moses went and he returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and he said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see whether they are still alive. If you back up a little bit, Moses has just been told by God, you are the one that I'm choosing. You're going to be the man of the hour. You're going to lead all these people out. You are the one that's anointed and chosen by God. First thing that Moses does is he goes to his father and says to him, hey, let me go. Interesting. I went through that little thing there, those three things that God did with Moses, with the serpent and then the hand and then now go and preach the blood. Notice that please let me go. Two things, humility and obedience. Obedience is not the right word. Submission, being in submission. Moses is like the head of this whole group, right? He would be like the pastor of a church. But he's still in submission. He's going to his father-in-law. In this time period, in this area, these clans were very protective over the people that were in there, because the more people you had, the safer you were. So if Moses left with his wife and his two sons, it's a knock to the clan. So therefore, he doesn't want to just walk out. But Moses could have walked in there and said, hey, God just spoke to me in that bush back there burning, and I'm the man, I'm out of here. What's Jethro going to say? Remember, Moses at this point is 80 years old. I've got a pastor that is my pastor. The guy's name is John Corson. And pretty much every single day I will listen to a teaching from him. And I can tell you something, I listen in the sense of, okay, Lord, what are you saying to me today? I have to be in obedience. Just because you get to sit on the stool or stand behind the fancy box or whatever it is, doesn't mean that you are now top dog. If anything, the structure of the church is not like this, that big pyramid thing, with the pastor sitting up here and everybody over here, and then the guys that clean the church. No, it's not like that. The structure is inverted. Okay, and that is the essence of Christianity, service. Christ washed feet. And that's church. That should be church, okay? So if anybody should be in submission to the word the most, it has to start at the top, as it were, but at the bottom, as it rightly should be. But that's where it's got to start. If you look at the life of Christ, he was in submission to God first and foremost. Okay? So here, this speaks of submission, and then Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." The reason why I went back and started looking at Jethro, why it bugged me, is that the phraseology there, "Go in peace." Shalom, that is peace. If you go and break that down further, go in, it means walk in peace, in shalom. Why would a Midianite priest pick those words to speak? This is, that's contrary to the Bible. I mean, that's contrary to, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, it would be like a Satanist telling you, "Oh, shalom." It just wouldn't work. That's what caught my attention and why I started digging into this guy Jethro. So interesting though, what's being said there, as I said to you, Jethro is the top of that clan. He's the head honcho in that clan. Moses leaving weakens his clan. Yet what does he do? He says to Moses, "Go in peace, you go for it." Jethro's got Moses' best interest at heart, not his own. Life lesson right there. So verse 19, "Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian," I like the way God puts that, in Midian, not in the church, not in the holy place or anything, in Midian, in the middle of the mess. God speaks to him, he says to him, "Okay, so go, return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead." This is now a second conversation that God is having with Moses. Okay, first conversation by the bush, and he tells him, right, this is what you're going to do. Time goes by, and now God's saying, "Okay, now time to go." Okay, and interesting how Moses argued all these things. This is like God's cutting him off even before he begins. Okay, well, how can I go to Egypt? They're going to kill me. God says, "Okay, go to Egypt, and by the way, all the guys who you're going to bring up as an argument, they're dead." For me, I love birds. I don't know if you've noticed around here when you see the hawks and now in the wintertime the eagles, when they're flying around, the safest place for a little bird to be is right next to that big bird. Because if you're right next to your enemy and you can see your enemy, it's a good place to be. Okay, if you're just sitting on the wire and the big bird comes down, he's going to scoop you up and take you. But flying around, those little birds are safe. So what the little birds do is they gang up, right? And you'll see them flying at the big bird, and they'll harass it and harass it and harass it, and eventually it'll move off, go away from here, and their young are safe. Here's the interesting bit: you never ever see the eagle or the big hawks turn around and fight with the little bird. All they do is they move around until they find a thermal, and then they just circle on that thermal, and they go up and up and up. It comes to a point where the little bird can't go up anymore, and he just rises above it. That's for you and me. For all the men who sought your life are dead. See, Jesus comes to us and he says, "Here, I'm giving you life and life abundantly." When you've got a bunch of little birdies picking at you, as we tend to get in this town, any small town gets it, okay? You get these little bird brains picking at you. Instead of fighting with them and wasting your time, do what Jesus said: live life and live it in abundance. As you live out your Christian walk, you just walk your walk, and the fruit is born. Those little bird brains that are picking at you, at the end of the day, they've got to eat humble pie, because it's like, how can you turn around and say, "Well, she thinks she's such a good Christian. Pick, pick, pick." Well, 6 months later, "Oh, she thinks she's such a good Christian." You're still walking the walk. Oh, and by the way, there's now 5 other Christians walking with her that she's brought to Christ, in the sense of shared her faith and been diligent with that. Now all of a sudden the person looks like a fool, pointing at you and saying, "Oh, she's such a holy Christian." Yeah, she actually is. Look, she's walking the walk. And that's what it's saying. God's saying, don't worry about the small stuff. Leave the small fry alone. He'll take care of it. So verse 20. "Then Moses took his wife and his sons, and he set them on a donkey. And he returned to the land of Egypt." Now that must have been a big donkey, because right here you got the wife, and the one son is older at this point already. Okay, he's a young boy. I'm not too sure. I think he at this point is around about 8, 9, somewhere around there. And then you've got this little baby. So that just kind of struck me as funny. That's just a Hebrewism. It's actually talking about, when it refers to a donkey in the language, the way it's been translated, it actually refers to donkeys. There's many donkeys, not just one. It's just the way that they wrote things back then. So here they're on the donkey and they're going to head on back. And Moses took the rod. Remember we spoke about that, the hot rod in his hand. By the way, anybody guess what type of hot rod that was? It's a Dodge Viper. There's one for you, Chuck. So he takes this rod, and now interesting, this rod, okay, remember God says to him, Moses, what's in the hand? He says, it's your rod, right? And then he says, throw down your rod. Notice something now. It's now, from now on, it's referred to the rod of God, okay? And that's what I was saying earlier about your ministry. When you first step into ministry, it's so easy to start worshiping the ministry. And it's funny how quickly you can get caught up in ministry and move away from God. And I was speaking to a young man, him and his wife were over in Hawaii, and they were worship leaders in a big church, and it was all going well. And they were there for a good couple of years. And yet he confessed to me that his relationship with God is dead. And yet they were leading worship every single week. And that's the thing, getting caught up in the ministry. Now here God says, okay, so throw it down. He throws it down, he picks it up by the tail, and now all of a sudden it's God's rod. Okay, it's God's ministry, and that's how it should be. So, verse 21, and then the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all the wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put into your hand. We're going to touch on that this Sunday, okay? So I'm not going to dig on that one now. So James, don't come and ask me about it later. And then he says, but I will harden his heart. So God is saying, but I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will not let the people go. That right there causes a huge problem. Many people, especially unbelievers, they say it's not fair. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God then kills Pharaoh's son. God then kills Pharaoh in the sea. That's not fair. You got to read the whole story, because if you go through the story, you will see the first thing out of Pharaoh's mouth is, hey, who's this God character? And I'm not going to listen to God. And then Pharaoh hardens his heart 7 times, 7 the perfect number. And then afterwards, God hardens Pharaoh's heart another 7 times. Your decisions, at the end of the day, God will confirm. That's a scary, scary statement right there. Your decision to continue with a sin when God places it upon your heart, hey, this is wrong. You need to let this go. Walk in a different way. You continue to do that, be careful. You're walking and treading a very, very, very dangerous line. I watched a short little documentary the other day on a guy here in the States who was one of the mass murderers, and he got caught, and in this interview, he gave a very candid interview, okay, and he was outspoken about it, and he kills his first victim as he graduates high school. And then he goes on for many, many more years. And he kills a total of, I think it was 17 people. And what he started off collecting roadkill and taking it home and dissecting it. That in itself is not a problem. I mean, that kid could end up being a brilliant veterinarian, a biologist. You know, there's so many. Or he could go the other route. Okay, that in itself is not a problem. Then as he went on in life, there were certain things, and he felt that there was, he had desires, and then he acted on those desires. And at first it was just a small desire, and then it kind of one thing led to the next, but he made a choice. And then once he got into it, he found that he couldn't stop. And interesting though, before every single kill, he would go and get himself drunk. All those killings that he committed, he was drunk. And it was almost in a sense trying to quell his conscience, if you want, or soften the blow, or whatever you want to call it. But he couldn't say no. But it started at a point, and that's what I'm trying to get at here. You say no often enough, God's going to, okay, fine. Now I'll harden your heart. Now you will say no. And New Testament says that you are going to be given over to your lusts and your desires. That's a scary, scary, scary place to be. So when God puts something on your heart, don't ignore it. You have to act on it. And I think that is probably a huge reason why our churches are dying like they are today, because there'll be something will be said in the church and God will work on that person's heart, even in the middle of Midian, as we pointed out here today. It might not be a spirit-filled, Bible-filled church. God can still speak to you there. God speaks to the individual, and the individual, thank you, Lord, I got the goosebumps, and you walk out the door, and that's the end of that. You say no often enough, that's what you're going to get. So, where is it? Okay, so then in verse 21, so then the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to, we were down further. I'll harden his heart. Verse 22. He's just saying now that Pharaoh he's not going to let the people go. Verse 22. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son and your firstborn. This is the first time that this phraseology is being used here in the Bible. Okay, it's a principle of first mention. From here on out, you will see the nation of Israel being referred to as God's son, his firstborn, his people. All that phraseology, this is where it stems from. Okay, so this is that principle of first mention. This is where it comes from. Interesting here that God, that the first sign that he gives to Moses, he says, okay, go and pull the water out of the Nile River, right? Pour it on the ground and it'll become blood. The commandment of that king, that Pharaoh, was, it's free reign, remember? Anybody finds a young male child, throw him in the Nile. And yet that's where God starts. Okay, you want to throw my kid in the river? Here we go. That's going to be blood. That's where God starts. So, and then God, that's the warning that he's going to give Moses. Now, interesting here, God is basically speaking prophetically. So, for me, it's like, okay, well, God, you already know that he's going to say no, and it's not going to pan out. You know, you're asking me to go and ask him about letting us go for 3 days, and you know he's not going to do it. Why bother? Why going through this big charade? Remember we had a little discussion just now about God making the blind and the deaf and the mute and everything, and bringing the problem into your life? All the charade wasn't for the Jewish people. This is so that the Egyptians, who worshipped many different deities, they would come to an understanding of who God is. And now the Egyptians would believe it. There are other verses later on that actually talk about that. And remember, the Pharaoh was viewed as deity as well. So, as we get into the plagues, you'll see it deals with a lot of their different gods and deities. So verse 24. Interesting little section that comes up now. Verse 24. And it came to pass on the way at the encampment. Now that encampment is just a word for, I went and looked that up. There's no camp out there where they are at on this trip. It's literally just a place where they're overnight. It could be a cave or anything like that. So at this encampment, that the Lord, that tetragrammaton there again, capitalized L-O-R-D, met him and sought to kill him. God spoke to Moses in the bush. He said, Moses, you're the man. Here he equipped Moses. He tells Moses what he's going to do, prophesies, sends Moses on the way, and now meets Moses when Moses is on the way to Egypt to go and do exactly what God said. Here, and this here is a Christophany again, a reference to Christ. Here he meets him on the way down there, and he's going to kill him. So, again, what's going on? So verse 25. Then Zipporah. Zipporah's Moses' wife, right? And she's a Midianite. She's not a Jew. Okay, she's a Midianite. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son. This is the little baby boy, right? And cast it at Moses' feet and said, "Surely you are a husband of blood to me." So he let him go. The he is capitalized. So this appearance of God, of Jesus, let him go the moment that foreskin landed there. And verse 26, so he let him go. Then she said, you're a husband of blood because of the circumcision. And now, if you read on, you'll see at this point she leaves him and takes the kids. What's going on? Here's the thing. Moses is chosen by God, right? Moses is given that lesson at the burning bush, right? By God. Moses is then given further instruction, okay, now it's time to go. But all of those things, just because Moses is, for lack of a better word, the pastor, that doesn't exclude Moses from obedience to God. God clearly says to go back to Abraham and says to Abraham, okay, when your kids get to 8 days old, you have to circumcise them. You have to set them aside for God. That's what sets you aside from the rest of the people. So here goes Moses with his own child who hasn't been circumcised, set aside for God. And he's now going to be the leader, and he's going to now go and rebuke Pharaoh in God's name. It doesn't work like that. Moses, first and foremost, has to be in obedience to God. So this time, this is why I say to people, you want to focus on the New Testament as to who Jesus is. Oh, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and his love, and it's all, it's the whole hippie mentality. But you don't want to get into scriptures like this. There's another side to Christ and to God that you need to look at and reconcile and see both sides of his nature. Yes, God is merciful as far as sin goes, but there will come to a point where he will draw the sword. There's a line in the sand that you don't want to cross. And like with pastors, it says there that not everyone should desire to become a teacher, because a teacher is going to be held to a higher account or higher accountability. Knowing the word, you're going to be held accountable to their word. You know the word just as much as I do, but more so the Holy Spirit that is deposited into you when you accept Christ and kind of gives you that nudge when you're going to do something wrong. You know that feeling inside that you get. I don't have to sit and tell you, hey, that's wrong. You've got that nudge from God right there. When you disobey that, just as Moses is, don't think that it's gentle Jesus, meek and mild. He carries a sword, and he will use a sword. So, in order to truly love God, you have to you've got to really get to know the person before you can truly fall in love with them. Otherwise, you're going to have one of those marriages where you marry someone and you think they're one way, and then after the honeymoon wears off, it's like, oh, gee, and then you want out of it very quickly. I mean, our law allows for it. You can get a marriage annulled in the first 6 months. You don't even have to go through the divorce process, because we know so many marriages happen before you actually get to know the person. So too with God. If you don't get to really and truly know him, you're going to walk out on him. So this is part of his nature and his character. And this is what happens here. Now she takes off. Interesting. She's the one that realizes what the issue is. And she's a Midianite. This lends more weight to what I was saying earlier on. These people are a remnant. They know what needs to be done. And she only circumcises the one son, the little guy. Why? The older one's probably circumcised. That would make sense. So she knows what the traditions are and what needs to be done. And if you go and read the original text, how it's worded, she says to him, "You're a bloody husband to me." And it's definitely one of those drop the mic things again. She throws down and she takes off. He doesn't get to see her now until we get right back to where we were reading about Jethro in chapter 19, I think it was just now. That's when they're reunited. Okay? She walks out. She goes back to her dad. So verse 27, and the Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he went and he met him on the mountain of God, and he kissed him. The first time that that Aaron walked up, was when Moses was saying to God, "Oh, I can't speak and I can't do this and da 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 da." In verse 14 of chapter 4, it says, "So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he says, Is not Aaron the Levite your brother?" Rhetorical question that's been asked. Now remember, Moses has been gone for 40 years. He hasn't seen Aaron. And now it just happens, this coincidence things, when he's arguing with God, God says to him, "Oh, by the way, isn't Aaron your brother? And he's a Levite from the tribe of Levi, so he's a priest." And then he says to him, "I know that he can speak well. Oh, and by the way, here he is. He's coming to meet you right now." And there's a coincidence. You see how quickly we can gloss over things and not even, not really take into account what's being said. I mean, that there's a huge miracle. Just happens out in the desert where Moses is looking after these sheep. Aaron just pitches up at the exact moment that the bush is burning and God is talking, and he's making that argument. And God, he's got such a sense of humor. So now in verse 27 he says, "And the Lord said to Aaron, Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went, and he met him on the mountain of God, and he kissed him." Verse 28, "So Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him, and all the signs which he had commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel." Now they've headed on down to Egypt. The first place they're going, they're not going straight into Pharaoh's court. They're going to the different tribal leaders of the different tribes down there.
It's still in Goshen at that time, isn't it?
Verse 30?
At that time.
Yes, they're in Goshen, which is part of the Egyptian territory. But it's also up northeast, okay? So as they're coming down from the eastern side, they're going to go through the land of Goshen, then they're going to proceed down to where Pharaoh is. So verse 30, "And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then he did the signs in the sight of the people, so that the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped." Who did Aaron speak to?
The elders.
Israelites. And now we'll see who does the speaking when they go to Pharaoh.
I agree.
You did. It's amazing how God's word works, eh? We said we were going to finish 10 minutes early. We're done. I would just, when you're going through this, go through this and nitpick it, because it's the little things that God uses to catch your attention, and it's the little things that he speaks so loudly. God says to you, I'm not going to speak to you, in thunder and lightning and all the rest of it. It's that still small voice. So when you're reading through something, and God's definitely speaking to you, because it's those little things that are catching your attention that you keep on bringing up, okay? And when he does that, he's speaking to you, and that has happened with me in my walk from the get-go. I've seen something in the Bible, that doesn't make sense, and I'll go off on a rabbit trail, and it's in those rabbit trails that God just seems to speak to me very, very clearly. Okay? Let's close in a word of prayer.